licks, motives, and riffs. Now, what musicians do with these melodies that we have talked about, they're creating little phrases. They're kind of doing little communication here, making sentences similar to writing, where they do one statement or phrase and then they do another statement or phrase. Example would be, let's see here. Okay, jingle bells. Okay, that's the end of that first phrase. And I messed it up, but you get the idea. There were these little melodies, small units of them are called phrases. Now, in jazz music, what musicians do is they can manipulate these phrases into different melodic or compositional things called licks, motives, and riffs. All right. So, looking at a lick, what a lick is, it's a phrase that is a part of a common vocabulary in improvised jazz. Basically what this is as jazz began to grow and more songs were written, jazz started to get a repertoire of common music that most musicians knew. And what started to happen later on in jazz music, especially when improvisation became very important later on in the swing era and definitely into the bebop era, what musicians started to do, not only were they making up their own little melodies, but they would give like a little tip of the hat to other musicians and songwriters by inserting different songs that they knew and would take little licks or phrases from other songs that would fit the same chord structure of the song they were playing, and they would insert that little musical quote into the song. And what I'll do in a second here is give you an example of what we're talking about. Next is a motive. And what that is, it's a small phrase that is used as a source for variation. So in other words, what happens during improvisation, a musician would take the melody, and what they would do is they would kind of expound upon that. They would say, take the first part of the melody that was just played that people know, and then they would start to turn a different corner, go off in a different way, so they use it in a different way or variation, so they could build their improvisation or their solo off of what was already established in the melody. And then third, what we got here is what's called a riff, and this is used more as a compositional technique, not so much used in soloing. And what it is, it's a repeated fragment of the melody, and it can be used compositionally to build off of. And a pretty famous bandleader composer that did this was Count Basie when we start to get into the swing era. What his band would do, instead of playing charts that were totally written out so that they would have to follow the music completely playing note by note by note, what they would do is they would have a melody and then they'd have like a collection of riffs that they would play. And you might have the saxophone section playing a certain riff that was borrowed from the melody, and then you'd have the trombones at a certain point come in and play another part of the melody. And what they would do is they would build kind of like a background to create a longer arranged song, which again wasn't written out. It was based on riffs. So if we go back and take a look at these different things, lick and motive here, the example that we're going to use is Heart and Soul, which I think a lot of people know on piano. I'll get that playing. Alright, so now I'm going to play the melody here. Oh! Let's try that again when it comes around. Here we go. Good. It may sound a little off because I've got a little technical problem going on here, but we're going to keep on going with this. So now we're going to take a look at lick, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to play part of another song that fits well on top of this and see if you can kind of figure out what's going on here. if you catch that, that was Flintstones. I'm going to turn this off here. That was Flintstones that I used. So instead of playing, I played okay, and Flintstones theme, chord-wise, just happens to fit over the chord progression of Heart and Soul. So in this case, I was able to borrow that lick from the Flintstones and use it in my little improv or my little solo and give a little tip of the hat to say, hey, you guys know the Flintstones theme? Here it is. And a lot of jazz players would do that when they're around a live audience to kind of get the audience involved in the music. Because that's one thing about jazz, which is really fun, is if you can get the listener really engaged, as a listener, you can kind of pick up on what the musician is going to do. And if you kind of assume something's going to happen, and all of a sudden it happens, it's kind of a really good feeling like, oh yeah, I totally know what that musician is doing. So again, this is an example of how you could use that using a lick. Now, let's check out motive here. So it's a small phrase that is used as a source of variation. So if we get our Heart and Soul back on again, and our melody, okay, so I'm just going to use that first part of that little melody here and see if we can change it up to vary it. Okay, so we took that phrase and just switched it up a little bit so we get a source of variation. And that the motive could be very similar. Let me turn this off again. The motive could be very similar to the actual melody, or as you're going along in the solo, that motive could get farther and farther and farther and farther and farther away from the melodic line if you choose to do so, if you're using that as part of your solo. Now, riff, we could still do this with this Heart and Soul example here. Again, it's going to be a repeated fragment of the melody that we can use to build off of. So let's check this out again. Alright, so our melody. Let's just use that first part. So we got that repeated C. Okay, here we go. So if we just repeated those three notes, what we could be doing is getting a little background going, and we could build on top of that more and more and more and more and more and use that as a compositional technique. So, to get out of this little slide here, we got licks, phrases from other songs, possibly, motives, phrases from the melodic content, which is switched up a little bit, and riffs, which is fragments of the melody that can be used to build up a big composition. So, that would be it for Lecture 2. I know it probably got a little bit meaty in talking about theory and scales and things like that. And again, read your book and review what it says in there. And as I had said in previous lectures, I will try to post some YouTube links to give you a little bit more supplemental material in talking about melody and rhythm and things like that. So I will see you for our third lecture in a bit.